Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Wadier.
And I'm Tommy Welling, and you're listening to the Fasting for Life podcast.
This podcast is about using fasting as a tool to regain your health, achieve ultimate wellness, and live the life you truly deserve.
Each episode is a short conversation on a single topic with immediate actionable steps. We cover everything from fat loss and health and wellness to the science of lifestyle design.
We started Fasting for Life because of how fasting has transformed our lives, and we hope to share the tools that we have learned along the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fasting for Life podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Wadier, and I'm here, as always, with my good friend and colleague, Tommy Welling. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Hey, Scott, how are you?
Fantastic, my friend. Excited for today's conversation. We're going to get into a conversation around insulin, fat storage, fasting, and all things in between. The inspiration for this episode came from a video that I saw from the illustrious Dr. Ben Bikman, who is one of the world's leading researchers on insulin and insulin resistance. One of the greatest books I've ever read, Why We Get Sick. So we're going to adopt a fasting for life nuanced approach to some of the things that he talks about. As always, we want to give you some actionable steps that you can do to put fasting into your day-to-day lifestyle starting today. So if you're new to the podcast, I want to welcome you in. If you want to know more about Tommy, myself, our stories, how fasting transformed our lives, head back and listen to episode 0 and episode 1. It'll give you some context into why we do what we do here at Fasting for Life, why we have our resources, our coaching program, our challenges, and ultimately why we're on this journey with you for a fasting lifestyle. So welcome in. Thanks for giving us a shot. Today is going to be a fun conversation. If you're a long-term listener, an AKA OG of the Fasting for Life lifestyle, thank you so much for your continued support, likes, rates, reviews, shares, all the notifications that we get. We are greatly appreciative of all of that. That continues to allow us to reach people, help them transform their life, and ultimately get the weight loss and health results that they are wanting. So, Tommy, I want to give a shout out to one of our favorite reviews, a 5-star kind. We are very grateful that we have lots of those. And this comes in from Happy User 58. The title is So Inspiring, Great Balance of Facts and Inspiration. So,
all right.
Thank you, Happy User 58, for being on this journey with us. Thank you for taking the time to leave us a 5-star review that tells the podcast world that we're bringing value week in and week out, which we can hope, which I'm confident that we can do today, and kind of talking about this concept of shrinking and burning fat cells by keeping insulin low and overcoming insulin resistance, Tommy.
Yeah, whenever we're thinking about low and slow diets, counting calories, counting macros, all of these things, a lot of us, many of us, especially if we came to fasting for fat loss purposes, which a lot of us did, then a lot of times there's experience with those kind of diet programs and some question about why don't they seem to be working for me or working as well as I thought it would. Why is my scale line not following what the app said it was going to be doing at this point, following 1 pound a week, 1.5, 2 pounds a week, maybe. And
why is the math not mathing?
Right. The math not mathing. So when we think about where do the personal differences come from as far as physiology versus math versus thermodynamics, if you will, then a lot of it has to do with actual responses within the body that stem from insulin resistance, and the actual interpretation and what the body actually decides to do with the calories, with the fuel, with the food that's coming in. And so that's where some of the nuance and some of the trickiness comes in. But we're going to simplify that for everybody today and go through just a couple of logical steps that we can follow, and we can hopefully use those to adapt to our next plate, our next fasting decision, our next fasting time, and then hopefully better align with our fasting and our health and our weight loss goals, right?
Yeah, the reality is that, you know, the state of the union, so to speak, the statistics don't lie. You hear us say this stuff all the time, which is why we're on this mission to help people pull people out of the matrix, is that, you know, dieting culture comes with a lot of skeletons in the closet. And a lot of us have failed attempts at losing weight, but more importantly, in our opinion, maintaining that weight loss. So 75% of the population is overweight or obese. Inherently carrying the extra weight in the moment in time is not detrimental to health, but over the long term, those fat cells become metabolically active. They skew the fat burning equation in terms of the calorie out part of the calorie in, calorie out equation. And it's not that we're trying to break the law of thermodynamics, but what it is the physiology that's underneath and the additional visceral, most importantly, visceral and or subcutaneous fat that we're carrying, and the lack of focus on the maintenance or what are we going to do for the long-term sustainability and body composition and all those things that create a healthy metabolic function and ultimately long-term health and longevity, is that those decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis are incredibly influenced by our food choices, our stress, our sleep. You've heard us talk about all these lifestyle components before, but when we're focusing on the root cause, the insulin resistance, the blood sugar variations, the lack of sleep, that then changes our metabolic function and or our decision making or our ability to just follow the old adage of eat less, move more, no pain, no gain, willpower-based type dietary approaches. And those dietary approaches don't lie in the fact that between year two and year three of maintaining those weight loss changes, inevitably leading to long-term health outcomes, between year 2 and year 3, 95% of people regain the weight. And a lot of the times, if they haven't been doing things right along the way, you're now in a more complex physiological state. You have that more recency bias of that last failure with your on-off diet mentality. Yep. And that's why we love the fasting lifestyle, because if you're a vegan or carnivore, or you live in a big city, or you live in a rural area in a tent, I don't know how you'd be listening to the podcast, but maybe with Starlink these days, you've got a good Wi-Fi signal. Right. But you get my point, is that it's adaptable to your day-to-day. And that's what we talk about, the fasting lifestyle and the customization and the personalization and why we do the challenges. And it's an intense 7 days of like deep dive into the why behind the results you're getting. So big picture, Tommy, I want to set the stage here and kind of looking at like a conclusion outline of what we hope to talk about today. And then we'll kind of break down some of the sub steps. When we're looking at dietary habits, right? Because fasting in essence is simple, right? Don't eat. But it's more difficult in application. So it's much more accepted these days. And we've had some shifts in our thinking of when the meals, and we'll get into that, when you should be eating, when you shouldn't be eating, what's the most ideal window, what's the best fasting schedule. If you're looking for support on that, head to the show notes, grab the Blueprint to Fasting for Fat Loss. It has some fasting schedules and some who, what, when, where, and why behind, some science, some application. But big picture today, Tommy, we're going to look at dietary habits in the obesogenic food world, the food noise-filled world that we live in, that lead to high-fat, high-carb foods or highly palatable, satiating foods that lead to overeating, that then inherently create a low-protein environment because protein doesn't happen by accident, as you always like to say,
right?
Which leads to less satiety, which leads to increased calorie intake, which leads to fat cell growth, which leads to metabolically active fat that creates a high insulin state or an elevation of insulin over the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, which results in insulin resistance, which then results in higher levels of chronic insulin, which promotes fat storage and or inflammation. And now we're in this cycle of trying to get off the crazy train of insulin resistance, which has an effect on inflammation, which then HSCRP, which is an inflammatory marker that binds to leptin, that blocks the signals of satiety to your brain. You get bombarded with all of these advertisements and food noise and convenience and the conversation of quality versus quantity in foods. So that's where fasting comes into play, is that when you fast, insulin ultimately comes down. You burn through the short-term glucose and glycogen stores, and you're able to tap into long-term fat stores, build ketone creation, so you can burn fat and lose weight more effectively, right?
Well, yeah, and all the while you're doing that, those then overfilled fat cells they begin to shrink, which means that they become less metabolically active, and then they become less influential in the hormonal cascade. So then they're not sending the wrong satiety cues, the wrong insulin cues to the rest of the body. So then balance starts to be restored within the system. So as the scale's coming down, you're feeling less cravings. Your fat cells are less communicative, if you will, which is a very, very good thing. And then you find yourself able to continue with that process more intuitively, needing less willpower, what you were alluding to earlier, right? And so these are the two sides of the coin. So on a day that's feeling tricky, you might ask yourself, like, what side of that coin do I want to be on today? Like which direction? Because like every small decision leads to one step in one direction or the other. That's just how I like to think about it, because it's not that takes us away from some of the all or nothing thinking that can be really, really easy to fall into, especially when you have a long history of dieting, calorie counting, macro tracking, all of these kind of things. They can really lead to a lot of all or nothing thinking. But we need to take deliberate actions to get away from that thought process, because it really is about each food decision, each fasting decision adding up, not changing everything, getting everything perfect or everything right all of the time. So if we come back to dietary habits, I feel like that's an interesting first place to start, because we're all going to need to make a whole lot of food decisions, even during a fat loss phase, even if you have 30, 40, 50, 100 or more pounds that you need to lose, you're still going to need to make a lot of food decisions. Maybe less in the short term, as you deliberately fast to burn through some of that excess weight that you have. But over the course of your lifetime, there's going to be thousands of more food decisions. And you talked about maintenance before and sustainability. We need to keep our eye on that prize, if you will, even during a fat loss phase, because long term, we're going to need to be prepared to make food decisions. And we can't just avoid food decisions for the rest of our lives, even if it feels a little bit easier in the moment. Like, I mean, how many hundreds of times, if not thousands, have we heard it feels easier for me to fast than to decide what I need to eat, and making good food decisions, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, 100%. And that's that willpower, white knuckling. Yeah, there are going to be moments where you need to rely on willpower, but willpower is not finite. I mean, it is finite. It runs
Right.
out eventually, right?
Mm.
So that's where we talk about habit formation, lifestyle adaptation, negotiating with yourself up or down in a decision of weakness. Where are you going to give in, or are you going to stay strong? One of the most listened to and downloaded episodes we have is episode 125, where we talk about willpower, won't power, and want power.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to fasting, there's a lot of won't and want that needs to happen, right?
Mm.
So you're going to be able to use that in times when you need it. But if you're consistently relying on it, that's when you're going to get in trouble, so to speak, with the consistency effort. So when we look at this mindset shift for this conversation, it's really needs to start with this unique dietary shift, like this idea that when you break your fast, you have an opportunity for a nutrition window, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can fuel your body. You can get in quality nutrients. You can prioritize protein. You can get in micronutrients. You can add, a complex salt, like a real salt, like a Redmond's or a Baja Gold or a Celtic sea salt, that helps balance the electrolytes and hunger cues. But this dietary shift, because right now, the modern diet is ultra refined, ultra processed, or refined, reprocessed foods, high fat, high carb, very high on the hedonic food scale of attractability, likability, palatability.
Engineered for those things too.
Exactly. And a lot of the processed foods remove protein. Now, there has been a movement lately where everything's protein, like if we go to my gym and you go to the little cafe, the stuff up on the counter is all protein chips and protein cookies and protein Pop-Tarts and
Protein hacks.
yeah. So I love that protein is being prioritized, but it's still a refined, processed environment. So is that good in a pinch? Sometimes, sure, but should that be the majority of this mindset shift around this dietary kind of conundrum that we're in this environment that we live in? Yeah, absolutely not. So when we're looking at this conversation around food choices, and we'll say this often, that the worst thing you can do before you start a long or extended fast, like the night before, is have a big dinner of indulgence and alcohol and desserts and things, and then expect the next fasting day to be that much easier.
Oh man. Yeah.
Because we just know that you're setting yourself up for a more difficult fast. So the nutrition window is really important to think long term, to begin with the end in mind, to make sure that about 80% of the time, so 24 out of 30 days a month, you're making quality food decisions to fuel your body, to set up a consistent fasting effort the next day. And that just doesn't happen overnight. That takes repetition, right?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And to speak about dietary habits and just the fact that, any diet can be compatible with a healthy lifestyle. It can be compatible with fasting, and any diet could be compatible with fat loss mode or a maintenance mode as well. The thing about that is that, if you take certain dietary restrictions and dietary preferences,
I'm never going to eat a carb again. I'm swearing off ice cream.
Yeah.
Oreo cookies are bad, whatever it is.
Sure. I mean, and then you can also go all the way to the extremes of, let's say, vegan and carnivore. Okay, for an example. And there's high fat, high carb ways that can kind of like sneak their ways into a lot of these dietary preferences. And so just to be on the lookout for that, especially if you've chosen a certain dietary way of life or way of eating, and maybe it's a temporary one or maybe it's a permanent one. Just understanding that protein doesn't happen by accident. Protein always needs to be a priority, but it especially should be front of mind when you are in a fat loss phase. You're trying to shrink these overfilled fat cells, and you're thinking about also like how did they get there? What happened? Because if you consider yourself a relatively healthy eater, but you have some weight to lose, or you have some symptoms or some blood work you're trying to balance out, then oftentimes you could still go back in time and start to put the pieces together, like how did I get here? And that can be helpful for making some decisions going forward. But even if you can't, or you're not sure where a lot of this came from, if you just prioritize protein going forward, it's going to be huge as far as satiety, like you said, Scott, setting the stage for your next fast, making it more intuitive, easier to stick with, reducing cravings that are going to help keep you from feeling like you're kind of white knuckling through the next fast, because you can only white knuckle through so many fasts and so many hours and so many times, and that gets really, it kind of wears on your mindset too, right?
For sure, any diet that you're on, right? You can stick to it for the short term, but in the long term, where does that sustainability come from? So
Sure.
let's talk about a couple. So in the spirit of the shrink and burn fat cells by keeping insulin low and overcoming insulin resistance concept, there's a couple of things that I found interesting that I wanted to touch on in terms of this conversation around sugar and fructose versus glucose.
Okay.
So we looked at, there was a study where participants drank fructose or glucose drinks with the same amount of calories. And they looked at the group that was drinking more of the fruit juices, the sodas, the high sugary beverages.
Okay.
Those folks,
group.
and this is gonna go into that whole shrinking fat, burning fat, ketone conversation here, and how we can optimize that with consistent fasting efforts. But the group that consumed more fructose in those sugary drinks, rather than the fruit in its natural form, right, that has fiber in it, though that group in that study was shown to have stored more visceral fat.
Yep.
And we know that visceral fat, so in that study it was fructose versus glucose. The fructose group stored more visceral fat. The glucose group stored more subcutaneous fat. So if we're going to prioritize the which one's worse, well, visceral fat absolutely takes the cake, so to speak.
Yeah.
And the source of that fructose matters. So fruit is fine, because we get this question a lot from folks. Well, fruit has carbs. I'm doing keto. I'm doing low carb.
When can I have fruit again?
You can have fruit every day.
Sure.
We have some people that I actually recommend breaking their fast with a big bowl of fruit. Because you're going to be increasing the GLP-1 and the insulin sensitivity. Now, if you're type 2 diabetic and you're on medication and that's going to throw your numbers out of whack, well, yeah, maybe you're not there or ready for that yet. Start slow, of course, right? But the idea here is that the source of the fructose matters. So when we're looking at this from a visceral fat standpoint, that's just one of the levers we can pull and a simple shift we can make to decrease that proliferation of that visceral fat. Alcohol is another one, right? Stress is another one. Poor sleep is another one. The cortisol stress response. Those are things that can promote and proliferate visceral fat creation.
Yes, disproportionately. So not correlated with the number of calories that are coming in, or not predicted just by the number of calories that are coming in. Because you can take because in those studies, they took the exact same number of calories, number of grams of sugar, fructose versus glucose, same calories, same metabolic efficiency in the body, but then different outcome. And that's because fructose has to go through the liver. So the way that it actually gets processed is a different biochemical process that results in more visceral fat deposition. And that's a real big problem, because it's much easier for the body to access the subcutaneous fat. It's a shorter process to burn through overfilled subcutaneous fat cells versus overfilled visceral fat cells.
Yeah, so if you're making a decision, breaking a fast, starting a clean fast, whatever that is, staying away from those fructose-laden drinks, eating the real fruit, even adding a good quality protein shake in, can be an alternative to that if you're struggling with that kind of concept or real life application. So the problem with visceral fat, though, which is what I really want to talk more about, is that visceral fat. So the idea here is when we have this increase in visceral fat, that's what leads to metabolic syndrome. And visceral fat is the thing that creates that chronic inflammatory state that then blocks leptin, satiety signals, hunger cues, etc. So when we're looking at visceral fat, the idea here is that we want to help the body burn the visceral fat more effectively and stay in that fat burning zone more consistently. So the idea here, the takeaway is the overgrown fat cells themselves become an inflammatory mechanism, which lead directly to insulin resistance. This is why waist circumference and waist to height ratio, which we've done episodes on in the past, and body roundness index are way more accurate indicative of an insulin resistant state, or the prevalence to develop an insulin resistant state within 5 to 7 years. So that visceral fat, for men, right around the belly, for women, the lower abdomen, hips, and thighs, that visceral adiposity is ultimately part of the problem. So the more we can leverage fasting in a consistent low insulin state with better quality nutrition choices, we're going to be that much more likely to then see the visceral fat removal and the burning of that visceral fat, which then kind of swings that metabolic equation in your favor, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so we need a low insulin environment. We need to extend those burn times. We need to then break the fast with good quality food choices that aren't then adding to that old problem that we've already created. And then we can see over time removal of those grams of visceral fat, of those depositions that have already been made. So when this is all to say, like, we want to keep satiety high. We want to keep cravings low so that we're not finding ourselves like making these decisions sometimes automatically or accidentally, because we can't always control the outside factors like the halt, the BS stuff, the hungry, angry, lonely, tired, bored, stress, some of the emotional factors that then even further perpetuate those cravings and kind of the in the moment, more automatic, subconscious kind of behaviors, where we just kind of like reach for a certain food or find ourselves wandering into the pantry or just looking around in the fridge, not necessarily having physical hunger, but a lot of times it's either boredom or stress. And most of the times, since those decisions aren't dictated by real physical hunger, they don't end up being actually nutritious or fulfilling or satiating. And so then the problem becomes a lot of times those food choices are only further perpetuating like the visceral fat deposition and the higher insulin environment that we're talking about. So if we can control some of the factors on the front end, then it leads to better results on the back end, if that makes sense.
100%. So fasting lowers insulin, shrinks fat cells, even when you're consistently eating day over day. And we want to focus on that low insulin state, that ketogenic state, right? So The way we do that, it's in the blueprint as well. We focus on prioritizing protein. So more recently, in 2025, we've seen a lot more studies come out. We've done a handful of them over the last few months that focus on the prioritization of protein. Most of the studies that we see that create a eucaloric state or an isocaloric state, and they look at calories burned and metabolic changes and lab improvements and blood pressure and triglycerides and anthropometrics like waist circumference and muscle, fat-free muscle and all that stuff in terms of the body composition and labs conversation, is we rarely see those studies of the protein percentage of their food choices get up above 20. Now, recently we've seen some studies 20, 25, and 30. So what we teach and preach and do in practice is we want to prioritize protein. And we mentioned that in the very beginning when I was doing the overview, that if we're consistently doing more of the higher fat, higher carb, more convenient type foods, that's going to lend itself to be a low protein environment with less satiety, increased calorie intake, ultimately increased fat cell growth.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're looking at a lever that we can pull, that's that intentionality of prioritizing protein and making it a 40% category. Now, the keto folks go, oh, wait a minute, what's that going to do? Well, we have a whole episode dedicated on the use of keto. I was an old keto guy with intermittent fasting. Short-term results were great. Long-term results were not. I'm just one person. We've heard this from dozens and hundreds of others. Keto in the short term is a great, like a true keto diet, less than 10% carbs a day. That can be great as a 90-day therapeutic approach. If you're dealing with neurological type stuff, or you're dealing with, chronic inflammation, or you're dealing with hormone imbalances, autoimmune issues, diabetes specifically, the blood sugar, A1C and fasting insulin and fasting blood glucose are tremendously improved with doing keto for 90 days. But if you tried to do keto, it's hard to fit that into a long-term plan. Like, what does maintenance look like? What does my day-to-day look like? Am I always going to be the person at the family holiday or the business lunch or the trip that's having to make all of these concessions, that's then relying on willpower to make that decision time after time after time and time again? So that's why the fasting lifestyle is so incredibly powerful.
Well, hold on. Also, on keto, one of the tricky things is that if you find yourself out and about a lot, or very social, or at restaurants and things like that, you can find yourself having an easier time to comply with keto sometimes, but you're having to rely on ultra processed, restaurant or convenient type foods that maybe the macros fit, but the processing is still there, where it's like your body's just not doing exactly what it would be doing with whole food sources. And so the macros fit, but then the physiology is still different. And you can still find yourself spiking insulin disproportionately from how you would with natural whole food sources that have the same macronutrient balance. So that's also part of the trickiness. And that's not to even mention yet the caloric load, because ketogenic is also obviously very calorically dense.
Yeah, because of the fat content, right?
Right, of course, which isn't inherently bad, but as you do shrink some of the fat cells and your metabolic rate naturally comes down as you have less extra fat on your frame, then you find yourself with less wiggle room, with less of a margin of error. So if you're not diligent in tracking, you could find yourself accidentally over consuming and over spiking insulin in a way that you thought you were doing the right way. So this is also part of why keto doesn't always work for everybody over the long term. It can, results can slow down over time.
So let's talk a little bit about the fasting application here. And one of the things that we see often, and we've changed our tune on this, is if you're starting an intermittent fasting lifestyle, you're getting back on track, the wheels fell off the wagon's in a ditch, it's on fire, the weekend happened. That's why we have our fasting types, right? So the weekend warrior, the gratuitous grazer, or the fasting freelancer. If the weekend got you and you're finding yourself restarting on a Monday, the easiest thing to do, especially in the very busy world, in our household for sure, with 3 kids, my wife's in practice, multiple businesses, 3 dogs, a horse, lots of things going on every morning. The easiest thing to do is just skip breakfast, right? So
sure.
If you're coming to intermittent fasting, it's like tried and true, 16-8 window, 16 hours fasting, 8 hours nutrition opportunity. And it's easy just to go 12 to 8. Right? So noon to 8, just skip breakfast, have some coffee, get your day started and go. The opposite side of it is there's a lot of people, and the generation before me, my parents' generation, was breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
Right. Yep.
But let's talk about breakfast and meal timing with a fasting state. Then we'll transition into ketones and then wrap up with a really cool nugget in terms of what fasting can do from a calorie burn standpoint, from a metabolic standpoint in a low insulin state. Is that when you look at this breakfast, there's two things. One is we've seen a lot of research recently that, and we've changed our tune on this, that eating earlier in the day is more beneficial, right?
Absolutely.
So shifting your meals, your nutrition window earlier in the day. Now that comes with complexity, like I just mentioned, with the day-to-day breakfast routine. Maybe you don't have as much flexibility or time at lunch. You're in an office setting.
Hard to say no to dinner.
Yeah, hard to say no to dinner with the family. Like, the dinner table is where, my wife is very big at holding us accountable to this, sitting around the dinner table together, especially when the kids are at camps and in school, etc. So there's some resistance there. But it's true, tried and true, that the later meal, less insulin sensitivity because your cortisol is supposed to be coming down later in the day, which then sets you up for a restful sleep, which then allows your body to have proper metabolic function and glucose and insulin regulation that following day, which leads to less saying yes to the stuff you don't want to be eating, and no to the stuff that you shouldn't be doing, and yes to consistent fasting and food choices. But the problem with eating breakfast for a lot of folks is just, if we just think about the most common breakfast foods that are out there, just think about the things that are served for breakfast.
Foods. Okay, I'm going to just put some air quotes around food sometimes.
Right? So what are common breakfast foods that people eat? Well, if you go to the frozen food section at the local Sprouts or Whole Foods, or you go to a restaurant, it's going to be pancakes and waffles and French toast and muffins and like high starchy, high carbohydrate breakfasts, especially if you're going to the convenient stuff, the prepackaged stuff, right?
Right, which who's not busy in the morning?
Right, it makes it easy, right? So the key with eating earlier in the day is making sure that you are prioritizing protein and getting in healthy fats so you can have satiety if that's going to be your meal for the day. So the thing that we hear from folks is, yeah, I did breakfast, but man, I'm hungry all day.
Right.
Yeah, what'd you eat for breakfast?
Yeah.
Right?
The more carbs, the less protein, the hungrier you're going to be all day long.
Because insulin's higher. So now that whole day that you're fasting or waiting for your next meal, your insulin is up. So you're preventing that ketogenic state. You're preventing that tapping into the long-term fat stores because your body's dealing with, especially if you've got visceral fat, dealing with burning off all of that stuff. So yeah, you are going to be hungry. Right?
Absolutely.
Ever give a kid some sugar? Blood sugar goes way up and then they crash and they become a little monster?
Yeah. And
because they don't have the frontal cortex to manage those emotions?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So if we are moving our meals earlier, we really need to be prioritizing the protein and fat to start the day. And then if you're going to be eating midday, yeah, that's the time to have your natural, unrefined, unprocessed carbohydrates, the rices, the sweet potatoes, the potatoes. Those things are not bad. Now, again, type 2 diabetic state, yeah, you got to watch that stuff. So going low carb for a while is probably the best thing for you, right? But later in the day, decreasing that carbohydrate intake if you're on a visceral fat loss journey, because that's going to help set yourself up for a low insulin state through the evening into the night, setting yourself up for sleep and better metabolic function that next day.
That's a great distinction. If you were trying to make the decision, should I skip breakfast or should I skip dinner? Which one could you have the better quality meal with a high quality protein content? Because that should be the one that you choose. Because I think the net benefit is going to be based on whichever meal that one would be. So if you have time in the morning, or you have an ability to maybe prep ahead so that you're having really protein packed breakfast in the morning, then you'll get the physiology, you'll get the benefit in your physiology later in the day by skipping that dinner. But if you can't pull that off, and it's going to be a more carbohydrate rich, quicker, more convenient breakfast, then just skip that so that you can wait until the end of the day when you have more time to prepare and have a much better balanced, more like a 40-40-20 good amount of protein meal.
And that's one of the things that we kind of differ with Dr. Ben Bickman on this. When I listened to that YouTube video and just kind of was thinking about, well, is this applicable for us? Can we have a conversation about this that would help our folks adopt a fasting lifestyle is the simple concept of skipping breakfast, right? So we've changed our tune on that recently. But what you really want to focus on, to your point, Tommy, is eggs, avocado, nuts, full fat yogurt, Greek yogurt. Avoid the sugary fruit juices, the breads, the cereals, because that's going to help reduce inflammation, stabilize your insulin throughout the day, and promote fat burning if you are going to continually use those fasting windows. So
make a great smoothie. Put some avocado in your smoothie.
Yeah.
Put some protein powder in your smoothie. I mean, you can do a lot with a smoothie. You can get pretty interesting with your ingredients.
Yeah, and keep it simple, right? Keep it simple.
Yeah.
So one of the last little nuggets I want to drop here before we wrap up with an action step or two is the fasting periods. Like, what is that doing? Right? So fasting periods where insulin stays low, it's been shown to increase your metabolic rate by about 300 calories per day.
Wow.
So extrapolate that over 7 days. That's 2,100 calories, right? Extra by staying consistent with your fasting efforts and putting fasting in the primary lever that you can pull. 1 pound of fat is 3,500.
Yep.
Right? So over the course of the month, if you start adding up those numbers, right? So 2,100 per week, 4,200 over 2 weeks. Now you're on a really consistent, stable way that's going to get you repetitions that will allow you to maintain those weight loss changes and not become part of the 95% of folks that give the weight back between year 2 and year 3 of a dietary weight loss lifestyle effort.
That's awesome. And that's in a way that you could see yourself maintaining that. So if you weren't expecting the scale to just continue to go down, but you do see those small changes adding up over time, then also think about the fact that you're doing the things that you need to do to maintain that progress. And guess what? It's a bonus that some of those fat cells are shrinking. You're burning through some of those long-term fat stores because the insulin's staying low.
So a couple of things here as we wrap up today, Tommy. A couple of different action steps that you can do. So one would be to eat breakfast, to shift your window, to try it on for size for a few days and see how you feel. However, with the caveat, don't make the breakfast blunder, which is the protein the pancakes, the waffles, the muffins, all that kind of stuff. Go for
better to have dinner leftovers.
Right. Dinner left. Great. My kids love when I make steak. And I usually make it in big batches because then they have steak the next morning with their eggs, and they love it. They're like, Dad, I want some steak. I'm like, get off my steak, kids.
Right.
Leave me alone. So that's going to allow you to stabilize insulin, reduce inflammation, etc. Another potential application for y'all today is during your eating window, focus on meals that keep insulin stable by prioritizing protein, healthy fats, and fiber-rich veggies over sugars and refined processed carbs. And focus this during your fasting window, if you need a little extra oomph, a little extra encouragement, is that use your fasting windows to reset that insulin and inflammation. So stay hydrated. Focus on prioritizing, hydration over just drinking water, and avoid the dirty fasts. Keep the fast clean. Avoid any of those excess calories, especially the ones from the sugary drinks, during your fasting to maximize those fast burning efforts and ketone production.
Yeah, I like that. That's also going to help you extend your fast a little bit too, because if you think about your fast, not so much as like, what did I set my timer for? Was it a 22-hour fast, or maybe it's a 40-hour fast, whatever the case may be. But instead of looking at it like what is the whole goal, think about it 1 hour at a time next time, especially if you've been having trouble like closing your window or getting past a certain sticking point. Just think about it. Just take it 1 hour at a time. You could literally set a 1 hour timer rather than a 30-hour timer, let's say, and then keep your head in the game a little bit longer, and then just look at it as the opportunity to make a decision. Do I want to break my fast now, or do I want to give myself an additional hour of low insulin ability to tap into those long-term fat stores? Then you can make that one decision each hour rather than feeling like it's this overwhelming long-term decision. If that's how you're feeling, which at some point in your fasting journey, that might resonate with you, even if you haven't been there yet.
100%. So in the efforts to shrink and burn fat cells by keeping insulin low and overcoming insulin resistance, different action steps for different folks. Pick one thing that resonated with you today and put it into your next meal decision. Put it into your next fasting window. Put it into your next, when you plan out your week on when you're going to be fasting and when you're going to be fueling and when those nutrition opportunities are. If you're looking for more guidance, you can head to the show notes. We've got a whole host of resources, the Blueprint to Fasting for Fat Loss, the Facebook community, the new fasting quiz. But pick something today and do it, because action always trumps. It always wins, and that's what we found year over year now with helping so many folks. Excited for what we're going to hear in terms of feedback from this episode, Tommy. As always, I appreciate the conversation, man, and we'll talk soon.
Cool. Thank you. Bye.
So, you've heard today's episode, and you may be wondering, where do I start? Head on over to thefastingforlife.com and sign up for our newsletter, where you'll receive fasting tips and strategies to maximize results and fit fasting into your day-to-day life.
While you're there, download your free Fast Start guide to get started today. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fasting for Life.